What's going on, everyone? Joey Antonelli here, and the entire purpose of this video is to go over the nonsense that is snook candy. Now, first off, if you've seen this picture before and you scanned this and that brought you here, let me know what tackle shop you were at, because I'm just curious where you came from. So, snook candy. What is the deal with snook candy? If you go on any of the fishing Facebook groups and you ask for a fish ID, post a little picture of something you caught or describe it, I don't care if it's a swordfish, a pinfish, a tarpon, whatever it is inevitable that someone is going to respond saying snook candy. And there's kind of a reason for that. It is a joke, but the reasoning kind of is snook eat everything. They have a giant mouth and they eat anything that fits in that mouth, or almost fits in that mouth for that matter. There's definitely fish that work better than others, and that's what we're going to go over in this video and kind of break it down and clear up some misconceptions about similar looking fish, like the croaker category, the mahara category, the whitebait category, and hopefully clear up some things for you. And now this is speaking from my experience, and names of fish vary depending on where you are. For example, this croaker is called a spot. It is a croaker. It's in the croaker family, just like a redfish is in the same family. Now, a spot in my area, a lot of people call them mizuki croakers. You go up north, go up to North Carolina, mizuki croaker, people look at you like you got 3 heads. They're called spots up there. It just depends where you are. So I'm speaking on what they are called in my area. Now let's go ahead, get into some snook candy action, kicking it off with the croaker category.
Oh, that's him.
Full of baits. We actually got a bunch more in the back live well. The first bait we're talking about here is the croaker, and it's the hardhead croaker. Croakers are thought of as being the very best snook bait, and there's a reason for that. A lot of times they work when other baits don't work. Now this is the hardhead croaker. You can tell what it is by the sharp gills, the pattern on the back, and the croaking sound. They definitely make a croaking, grunting sound. Croakers, hardhead croakers can be caught hook and line or in cast net. Hook and line is probably the more common technique for them. And the hardhead croaker is usually the most common croaker when it comes to bait shops, when they're selling croakers. And that's because they live so well and they're a lot cleaner than some of the other ones. Meaning they don't dirty up the water and they just last longer, they don't get all beat up. So when you see a bait shop selling croakers, there's a good chance it's going to be the hardhead croaker.
That is a nice one. That's what we got going out.
Now we got the mizuki croaker, or the spot. The spot can be easily identified by the big spot. Almost looks like a false eye a little bit behind the regular eye. And also it's a softer croaker. It's the only croaker we're going to talk about that has like a softer body. There's nothing sharp on it. I mean, the fins might be a little prickly, but even the scales are softer. The mizuki croaker can be anywhere up to about a foot long if it's really, really big, but more commonly used for bait in like the 5 to 6 inch range. Now the mizuki croaker is a dirtier croaker, meaning if you're going to be trying to keep these alive for a while in a live well or a bucket, you're going to be doing more water changes than you will with the other ones, because they really dirty up the water, and that could affect how they live in there. But they can be kept alive overnight like all the other croakers. Or even for longer periods of time if you take good care of them by changing out your water and making sure they have plenty of air. The mizuki croaker, although it's not the most common one found in shops, you will definitely be able to find it in bait shops. It's a great bait for both fishing the beach, fishing the river, fishing offshore, whether it's snook, grouper, tarpon. It's an awesome bait to fish, and it's probably my favorite summertime snook bait.
Let him go.
Now we're moving on to the yellowfin, or the Cuban croaker. Now the yellowfins are the dead giveaway that it is a yellowfin croaker. They have stripes going sideways and vertically on their body, and they have a little bit of a harder gill. They're kind of between the hardhead croaker and the spot. They have hard scales, a little bit harder gills, and a little bit more prickly fins than the spot. And they seem to be more common the further south they go. In my area, we don't use them a whole lot. I'd rather use a spot or a hardhead croaker. But further down south, especially down towards like the Jupiter area, you will see these for sale from the bait boats and maybe in some shops also. But it is a croaker. It works for snook. They're pretty easy to keep alive, just like the other croakers. Just make sure you're doing water changes and not overloading a bucket. With a 5-gallon bucket of, say, 6-inch baits, I wouldn't want to put more than maybe 8 or 12 good-sized croakers of any kind into a 5-gallon bucket. Let's move on to the whiting. Whiting isn't my favorite bait to use for snook. It's more what I use when it's what I have. I go to the beach, all you need is a rod, you throw out some fish gum or some sand fleas or shrimp, and you can pretty easily catch whiting pretty much the entire summer. Especially in the 5 or 6-inch range, they can work really, really well for snook. Now they don't swim around or freak out as much as like a spot or mizuki croaker would, but they are pretty easy to keep alive. They vary in size and color. There's different species. There's the kingfish or the whiting, northern kingfish, southern kingfish. But again, I'm going by what they're called in my area, and people pretty much refer to all of them as whiting. The whiting works great. No downside to it, no sharp fins. The only thing I would say is they're a little bit sluggish, but they do work very well and will produce some snook for you throughout the summer. There he goes. Sick, dude.
Nice.
The pinfish, or the sailor's choice, is a pretty easy one to identify. It has a lot of yellows, a little bit of blue, purple, a lot of white, and it's got a dark back up top, and it has definitely earned its name. Even though they're not venomous, you want to be pretty careful when handling them because they have very pointy spines pretty much all over their body. It's a bait commonly found at bait shops. They're really easy to keep alive. They're a little dirty. You got to make sure you keep your water clean if you're going to be keeping them for a whole day or overnight or something like that. But they are a pretty easy bait to keep alive, and they live for a really long time on the hook also, which makes it a pretty good bait to have. Pinfish can be found all over, whether it's on bridges, docks, pilings, mangroves, or even near shore on the reefs or in the open flats inshore. The pinfish are usually caught hook and line. They can be cast netted as well or caught in pinfish traps, but the normal technique I use is like a number 6 or number 8 sabiki and then tip it with some fish gum or some shrimp, and that will get the job done for you.
30-inch fish.
There.
Whoa, Spidey on!
The pigfish is going to be really similar to the pinfish as far as everything about it, really, aside from how it looks. I mean, it has less spines. It's not as hard to handle as the pinfish. And the design on the fish with the orange stripes and the splotches is not as exaggerated as you see in this picture. A lot of times the orange will be very faint. It just depends on where the fish are when you catch them. Now, you'll find them around the bridges, the pilings, the grass flats, near shore, offshore, all that sort of stuff. Pretty much everywhere you will find pinfish, and you catch them the same way. Usually hook and line with small little pieces of bait on there. Cast net works from time to time too, and they make a grunting noise, a really loud piggy noise, we'll say, and that's how they get their name, the pigfish. And I don't know if it's the grunting or what it is, but sometimes that really gets the snook going, and they end up working out really well.
Oh, that's him.
Mullet are one of the most well-known fish around, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them because chances are you probably already know about them. So the mullet have a yellow spot on their gills. They have a little bit of spiky dorsal fin and anal fin. But other than that, they're pretty easy to handle, pretty plentiful throughout the state. We have a big mullet run in the fall going through the winter, and there's several different species of mullet, but for the most part, people look for the big silvers or the finger mullet. And those are great baits for an incredibly wide variety of fish.
Barely hooked, barely hooked. There he is. That's what we've been after right there. Look at them all chasing it up. Oh my god, there's so many.
The threadfin or the greenback or the greenie, whatever you want to call it, this is an awesome bait. You can catch them on sabiki or in a cast net, but when you catch them in a cast net, it really does some damage to them and affects the way that they're going to last throughout the day. It's a bait I would not recommend trying to keep overnight because they're not very strong. They do not do well in live wells overnight. If you have a big bait pen and access to keep that on the water, you might be okay if you caught them on sabiki. But I would say don't plan on doing that. Just catch them and use them for bait pretty much immediately. Now, this is a bait that people mix up a lot of times. They call both threadfins and pilchards or scaled sardines, they call them all greenies, and they're not. This is the greenie, this is the threadfin. You can tell it has that thread coming off the dorsal fin. That's the easiest way to tell the difference between this and a scaled sardine or a pilchard. Also, it has a smaller eye. Now that's really important to know because it's a lot weaker than the others, and you don't want to be getting a big old live well full of these, thinking you're going to be keeping them alive overnight, and then be heavily disappointed when you have a live well full of dead baits the next morning.
Oh my gosh. Oh, he's already kicking. He is already kicking, probably because we put so much heat to that fish. Turn in.
Here we have the pilchard or the scaled sardine, and it's very easy to see why this fish is so commonly mixed up with the threadfin. They look very similar, same profile, same coloration. Again, that big difference is the eyeball and the lack of thread coming off of the dorsal fin. Also, when you feel the fish, the pilchard is a harder fish. It has harder scales on it, and it's a much stronger bait, a much hardier bait. I'm still not a huge fan of keeping these in live well overnight. If I only had a handful of them, maybe I had like a dozen or 2 dozen, I was going to go fish the beach in the next morning, I wouldn't mind putting them in my big live well to keep alive overnight, but they aren't as good as keeping croakers, pinfish, or pigfish alive overnight. Awesome bait, very strong on the hook. They freak out a lot in the water. They let you know where the snook are. It is a really good bait to use, and you're going to catch it the same way as the threadfin, which is either sabiki or cast net.
So to give you an idea for the size, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's a 36-inch fish. Now is the pogie. Send him right out there.
The pogie is an awesome bait to use for all sorts of fish. It's incredibly oily. Unfortunately, it is incredibly hard to keep alive. I would never recommend trying to keep them alive overnight, but when you have the opportunity to fish them fresh, it is a really, really good bait. They range from little teeny little pogies, which are also called Manhattan or bunkers, or bumpers even, depending on where you're at, all the way up to big old turbo pogies that can be over a foot long. For snook, it's kind of like the magic bait size I like is the 5-inch, 6-inch range, and they are a phenomenal bait. They're not a very strong bait, so if you can get them out in the water right after you catch them, that's probably going to be your best shot to get a nice fish on a pogie. It's a really soft bait, nothing sharp on them. Really, really good bait to use if you can find them in the area you're already fishing in.
Such a good fight. She looks ready. Hornbelly. You want me to try and break them off it?
The hornbelly is definitely the most underrated fish on this list. They work really well. I've used them many times, but for whatever reason, people have it in their head that hornbellies don't work for bait. They're a strong fish. They're a lot stronger than the threadfins, not quite as strong as the pilchards, but they still work really well. They have like a really smooth, leathery feeling skin, and they have horns that protrude off their belly. Now, this is not to be confused with the leatherjack. We'll show you that one in a little bit. The hornbellies are not venomous, but they do have some spines that could definitely sting you. They work really well for snook, for tarpon, for kingfish. You can find them pretty much in the same areas you find the pilchards and the threadfins. You can catch them on the sabiki, you can catch them in the cast net. It is a bait you do not want to overlook, especially if you can't find anything else. Give the hornbellies a shot.
I think Simon's fish is about ready. Logan's is probably good too. Bigger fish?
Now we're going to talk about some maharas. Now there are a ton of different kinds of maharas, but the ones we're going to talk about in this video are these three. We're going to kick it off with the silver mahara. When you see bait shops selling mahara, this is almost always the one they have. There's this one, the round one, and then the longer one. And they might even be two different species, I'm not sure. But this is the silver mahara. This is what we use for snook all the time, down at the inlet, at the beaches in the summertime. It is an awesome bait. Usually caught in a cast net. Every now and then you'll get them on sabikis when you're trying to catch pinfish or something like that. But they are hard scaled. They have some spiky fins to them. They are an awesome, awesome bait. Pretty easy to take care of. Very low maintenance, but just make sure you got clean water and good air on them. Now we're moving on to the sand perch. The sand perch, especially when it's smaller, can be pretty easily confused with the silver mahara. The easiest way to tell the difference is the different color fins. They have a yellow fin and then dark dorsal and tail fin. It's a fish that does work well for snook in certain areas, but for the type of fishing I'm doing and in the areas I'm fishing, I usually try to avoid them. The last mahara we're going to talk about is the goat or the striped mahara. Now again, when they're smaller, they are pretty easy to confuse with the other maharas that we've already talked about, but it does make a difference when you're fishing them. If you're in an area where these don't work very well, like the areas I'm normally fishing, you probably want to avoid using them for bait. And the easiest way to tell it's a goat mahara or a striped mahara is look for those stripes. Also, the anal fin is like a dagger on these things. They get a lot bigger too. They get well over a pound, and they're actually really good to eat. They can be commonly caught in cast nets in the creeks and in the canals, and they do work really good in some places, especially for some really big snook.
Big old ladyfish. There he is.
No snook candy list would be complete without ladyfish on it, and that's because ladyfish are awesome for catching absolute giant snook. The only problem is ladyfish are pretty hard to keep alive, so unless you're in a boat with a live well, it's going to prove to be pretty difficult to transport them. Now, ladyfish are long, streamlined fish, giant forked tails. They're really fun to catch on light tackle, throwing different plugs, topwater plugs, lures, swim baits, jigs, live shrimp, mullet, whatever. They're a fun fish to catch, but when you got the right size and you got some big snook around, they are an awesome snook candy. Now that's going to be the last one for my list. I want to know in the comments what you guys have caught snook on that I didn't mention in the video. And then also I'm going to flash a quick picture here. This is a leatherjack. It is not on my list of snook candy, not because snook won't eat it, because I'm sure they will. I think I actually have caught snook on them before, but you got to be pretty careful handling them. They have some kind of venom. It'll sting for a while. Depends on the person's reaction for how bad it'll be, but just watch out for the leatherjack, throw them back, not worth the time, and get out there and catch some fish.
Oh my God. Look at that pig. That is a beast.